All right, in our part 2 today, we're going to be looking at Christ and compost towards an Eco-Christology for the end of the world. So please join me in welcoming Ryan Cagle.
What an obnoxious title. I'm a sucker for him, though. Where's this? I'm nervous as hell. Put me in front of cops at a protest or in a pulpit in a Pentecostal church, and I'm fine. Put me here, it's a different story. So, yeah, we're good. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I would like to start just with a brief imaginative exercise, if you will. Just close your eyes with me. I want to kind of take you on a journey. I couldn't bring Alabama with me other than myself, and I can't technically carry you to Alabama with me, but I would welcome you. Our porch light is always on at 318 White Street, Parrish, Alabama. But if you will, just close your eyes for just a moment and imagine with me that you're in the Deep South. It's July. It's hot, like really hot. The humidity makes you feel like you're wearing a soaking wet, full-body sweater. You were out on our ministry, Jubilee House's farm, where we grow okra, sweet potatoes, cowpeas, tomatoes, and a whole host of other staples in an effort to combat food apartheid in our community. It is almost time to transplant our tomato sprouts from our greenhouse into the soil on what was once an old football field. Getting this Alabama red clay amended has been no easy task, and the efforts are still ongoing. If these tomato plants are going to have a chance, they need help with the transition from the greenhouse to the earth in the form of nutrient-rich compost. We walk over to the compost bin, and I ask you to plunge your hands deep into the rich black loam. It feels warm, moist, and a mix of soft and gritty between your fingers. Now, with manure and microbes caked underneath your fingernails, I talk to you about how the temperature beneath the surface must reach an optimal degree for it to become fertilizer for this garden. You hold a handful of this thick black hummus in your hands. It smells like death, and though the vestiges of decay are evident, by the living faithfulness of a cadre of crawling critters, some too small to even see, even death is somehow being transfigured into life. The soil conditioner is not quite ready yet, though, and I explained that while the earthworms and roly-polies, or pill bugs, depending on where you're at, we brought up from the forest floor last summer worked tirelessly in an almost symphonic-like fashion to transform this organic matter into something useful, that we also must do our part by turning this pile of brown and green matter over and over and over again. With patience and faithfulness, we will eventually catch a glimpse of resurrection. Soon this compost will go directly back to the soil so that we can continue to grow food in our community that is suffering under the effects of ecological crisis and food apartheid. Thank you for taking that trip with me. We'll return briefly at the end. Despite being relatively mundane or even grotesque to the untrained eye, compost communicates one of the numerous miracles of life, echoing that carpenter from Nazareth's words when he said, "Unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." In a way, compost can be understood as resurrection in a bucket. I believe that this makes it both an apt method and metaphor for fleshing out a new Christic paradigm capable of rising to meet our present ecological crisis by inviting us to turn over our Christologies again and again until they become rich fertilizer for the struggle for collective liberation. I will not be presenting to you today an actual compost Christology, but a method and metaphor for doing Christology, and we'll get to that later. Humanity has found itself in a profound moment of ecological crisis that is the fruit of decades of ecological overshoot, mismanagement of our planet's natural resources, and the death-dealing theology of the Western Christian colonial capitalist project. What a mouthful. This is not news to many of us here, and it was definitely not news to many like Sally McFaig, Elizabeth Johnson, Norman Wurzba, and a whole host of others who have been persistent voices crying out in the wilderness for a different way of doing Christian theology, being in relationship to creation, and understanding the person and work of Christ, considering what was then only a looming but preventable ecological crisis. Unfortunately, we failed to listen to the prophets that were sent to us, and now we find ourselves faced with an unpreventable effects of large-scale climate catastrophe, leaving us with no choice but to find new ways to face this apocalyptic moment, both practically and theologically. While I am not the first to put hands to the plow in the fields of eco-Christology, much less eco-theology, I hope that through patient and tender care that I will provide the raw material for us to begin to amend and revitalize the soil from which a new eco-Christology can emerge. What follows then is just my meager attempt to cultivate a space for the work of composting to bloom into a theological method and metaphor for doing this work of Christology. In conversation with thinkers like Sally McFaig, Victor Anderson, and Catherine Keller, I will seek to build on their prospective projects in a way that seeds an eco-theology for the end of the world, for what I define as a theology that exists as the critique and reconstruction of the relationship between the divine, humanity, ecosystems, and the entire cosmos in a way that cultivates land-connected spiritualities of liberation that can adequately respond to our present apocalyptic situation. Eco-theology for the end of the world is currently the working title for my upcoming thesis. The shifting Christological climate. Oh, wait. Let's go ahead here. I hit the wrong button. There we go. Despite societal denial, we are currently seeing the first fruits of massive ecological shifts that have been expected by scientists and as the long-term effects of climate change have set in. For decades, climate scientists, activists, and theologians have been shouting from the rooftops with a clarion call for change, and yet we are, in a sense, too late. While laying out the current ecological data and the climate models for the coming years is beyond both this presentation and my own training, it is abundantly clear that we are in the very precarious moment that is leaving or will leave the most vulnerable of our planet, enduring the disastrous effects of our neglect and abuse of the environment. My own community is racked with pollution from power plants, groundwater that is permanently will be polluted. And so this idea of a looming climate catastrophe is not theoretical. We have communities all over the world and all over this country who are experiencing the direct effects of it now. Sally McFaig reminds us that the most vulnerable are, as I have called them, do not merely belong to the human population, but that of all life, animal and plant species alike, that now make up what she calls the new poor. It is the emergence of this new poor in the face of our shifting ecological climate that demands wide-scale shifts in the very heart of Christian theology, which is to say Christology. This is not a novel idea. Many theologians have come before me and tirelessly worked the fields of eco-theology, hoping to yield fruit capable of combating the dominant and death-dealing theologies of our world and preventing this ecological catastrophe. Thinkers like eco-feminist theologian Sally McFaig and others have been addressing the problems with our current Christological models head-on while attempting to convince us of the importance of developing new Christologies for addressing these ecological issues. To sum up is why this is important Christology is to be in conversation with the ecology when, sorry, I messed up there. Sally McFaig, to sum up Sally McFaig, the importance to putting conversation with ecology with Christology can be summed up as the symbol of Christ is the most important symbol in the Christian tradition. To address the ecological crisis, it is critical for theologians to explore, explore the intersection between ecology and Christology. Both thinkers like Sally McFaig and others have gone to great lengths to highlight the problems and pitfalls with our current models and have sought to offer new potential Christologies while also exploring how various Christological motifs can be reinterpreted through an ecological paradigm. It is the latter work that I find most helpful for my own means of constructing what I understand as a compost Christology. All those presently doing the work of eco-theology are undoubtedly in debt to the strides these theologians have made in this field, but it seems fair to say that their dreams of prevention are no longer realizable. The climate crisis is here, and the fruit produced by the eco-theological projects of the past several decades have proven unable to change the collective theological imaginations of our churches, much less the masses. While I do not intend to sound like the doom and gloom prophets of my dispensationalist-soaked theology of my youth, I believe we must be honest about the eco-theological projects that have come before us and their apparent inadequacies. If we are to find a way for them to become compostable material for the fertilization of new potential theologies capable of responding to this no longer preventable crisis, While this may appear on the surface to be a bold and potentially arrogant statement, it is in fact not a claim I make flippantly, but from a deep gratitude for the work of those who have sown seeds of Eco-Christology that make this conversation even possible to begin with. So then we must ask ourselves, does this apparent failure signify that eco-theology and eco-Christology are to be understood as dead enterprises? I would say both yes and no. In a way, thinkers like Sally McFague intuited the failure long before it became abundantly clear that the new Christology would not be enough. In her essay, In Ecological Christology, Does Christianity Have It?, Sally McFague ultimately concludes that the continued refinement and development of ecological Christologies would not be enough, but what is now necessary is to learn to embody and practice ecological Christologies so that we can live out these Christologies in relation to nature. Unquote. Despite McFague making this Christological shift over 20 years ago, we still find ourselves face to face with the crisis of climate and Christology. The present Christological crisis. While well established by the work of others, it bears repeating that the climate crisis is a theological crisis, which for Christians means it is a crisis of Christology. It is not only that Christianity has failed to respond adequately to the ecological crisis, but that it is at its very root, as Lynn White Jr. has noted, the crisis, it is at its very root, the problem of this ecological crisis, as Lynn White Jr. has noted. This crisis is the direct result from the Christian theology over the last several centuries. Digging further beneath the surface of these claims reveals that we have ultimately failed to follow the instructions of the Proverbs by keeping our heart with all diligence, neglecting that from it flows springs of life. Sorry, I just closed out of the whole manuscript. Yeah, here we go. In our neglect, we have, despite some of our best efforts in amending the soil, lived out a Christology rooted in an improper relationship to the earth that has produced thorns and thistles. As Ellen Davis makes notes, the well-being of humans and the enduring fruitfulness of the earth are inseparable elements of a harmony sometimes imagined as covenant encompassing all creatures. And so, too, we might conclude that the development of a liberatory Christological praxis envisioned by Sally McFague also depends on the recovery of such a relationship to the earth and to the soil. While Sally McFague may be right in thinking that Christology is not enough and that we instead need to move towards real praxis, she does not offer any real examples for living out this praxis-oriented Christology in our world, save the minimal life changes prescribed to her primary audience of affluent and educated Christians. It is here that our Christological crisis becomes most clear. Not only have we failed to provide any Christological formulations capable of reshaping our collective theological imaginations, but we have failed to actively incarnate a life-giving Christology that could orient us towards the earth in any meaningful way. Where eco-theology falters then, as theologian Victor Anderson has claimed about Black liberation theology, is that it has remained alien to the regular life and practices of our churches and cultures. As much as I love these thinkers, they have very little to say to those in my community suffering under the weight of a power company that owns everything and destroys without any delay or with any consideration. While I agree with McFague that Christology is not enough in the broad sense, I disagree in that I believe that any real ecological Christology must by necessity produce radical praxis in the method that it develops, the tools that it implements, and the liberatory practices it provides for reorienting our lives towards the earth. Or to summarize a different way, our Christological crisis is rooted in the reality that we have failed to live out an incarnational Christology, both in our theological method and our collective practice. It is only when we hold the work of theology captive in the halls of academia and communities of affluence that Christology is forced into this false dichotomy of becoming an either-or exercise of theology or lived praxis. Critical to the work of fleshing out a new Christic paradigm and the development of an operable method and metaphor for the work of eco-theology in the face of our current apocalyptic moment is our ability to cultivate space for both the dead theological matter of the past, or browns, what we would say when you're putting browns in compost, and the dynamic theological projects of the present, or greens, to be placed alongside each other in the compost heap. Here and only here in the muck and mire of the contradictions of old and new, high and low, and the grotesquerie of life and death present in the compost bin, can we faithfully and intentionally produce a rich compost Christology with the potential to amend the soul of our context and give rise to a variety of new Christological practices. Composting is theological method and metaphor. So far in this this presentation, I've discussed composting in relatively abstract terms, but now it's time to define compost more thoroughly and articulate specifically how it can be understood as a theologically rich metaphor and method for doing the work of Christology and eco-theology more broadly. The National Resource Defense Council defines composting as the natural process of recycling organic matter such as leaves and food scraps into a valuable fertilizer that can enrich soil and plants. Anything that grows decomposes eventually. Composting simply speeds up the process by providing an ideal environment for bacteria, fungi, and other decomposing organisms to do their work. The resulting decomposed matter, which often ends up looking like fertile garden soil, is called compost. As the NRDC rightly notes, composting is a joint effort between humans and worms and many other organisms working together to intentionally transform with the natural processes of death and decay. Organic material to turn organic material into abundant life-giving matter. This new material that emerges from the process provides the necessary nutrients for life of the soil and plants in our gardens. In composting, nothing is wasted that can be saved, as the ingredients for healthy crops pass back into the life of the soil through tender and faithful decomposition. Thank you, Alfred North Whitehead. While I do not mean to romanticize the work of composting, it is indeed difficult to not marvel at the whole undertaking. Even with all of its grotesqueness, composting is not always easy. You must know that certain things cannot be composted because of their inability to be broken down or the potential for introducing disease into the heap. The process is so much more than throwing scraps into a bucket and moving on with your life. Composting takes a type of faith, or rather fidelity to the process, or you will inevitably end up with a stench-ridden garbage rather than useful fertilizer. Healthy compost depends on the right relationship with the compost heap and all the life and death it contains. While I am sure that on the surface level it is fairly obvious why I believe that compost and the work of composting are great candidates for such a theological project, it is now time for us to, like we did in our beginning imaginative exercise, plunge our hands below the surface of the compost heap and become more acquainted with this pile of decomposing scraps and manure and see what they had to teach us about Christology. In Victor Anderson's book, Creative Exchange, A Constructive Theological African-American Religious Experience, he articulates a theological concept and framework that I find incredibly useful for fleshing out this work. I believe that Anderson's philosophical project of creative exchange, or what he describes as an approach in which constructive, innovative deployment of concepts themselves do the work of interpretation, pretation, criticism, and directing possibilities toward openness. And its use of the grotesque as it functions within his larger project in particular will prove fertile soil for the development of a compost Christology. To quote Anderson at length regarding the grotesque ought to not be thought of as an opposition between diametrically opposed sensibilities, yet it has to do with sensibilities that are apparently oppositional, such as attraction and repulsion or pleasure and pain. However, the grotesque seeks neither the negation nor mediation of these sensibilities. It leaves them ambiguous and unresolved by negation or mediation. It is the grotesquerie and ambiguity of our theologies and concepts that holds the potential to give rise to meaningful and creative exchange and interplay that can produce truly novel Christologies and liberatory practices. Compost within the context of creative exchange becomes the place in which the grotesquerie between life and death is not resolved but held together in all its complexity, giving rise to something new from the interplay and exchange that happens just beneath the surface of the compost heap. Likewise, when applied to the work of ecological Christology, particularly in the face of our present climate crisis, composting as a theological method becomes the location from which we can learn to hold the Christologies of the past and present together in all their contradictions, facilitating the process of creative exchange. This is not merely a type of Christological Marcionism that aims at a synthesizing these ideas, but just as compost does not combine life and death, but create something new out of the exchange between them, so too does compost Christology seek to cultivate space for new Christologies rooted in radical praxis to come to fruition. This is not a utilitarian approach to Christology, but one that recognizes that in every generation, faithfulness to a tradition is a willingness not to uphold what we have received uncritically, but a willingness to reimagine and reinterpret them in our present moment. Composting as a methodology helps us to avoid the pitfalls of believing that there is a once and for all Christological solution to our problems, both theological and ecological. All soils are different and in need of different amendments, and instead, this compost works to develop a new Christic paradigm that is constantly asking us to be faithfully turned over and over again. Compost Christology calls us to cast our various Christologies into the compost heap, the old and the new, the high and the low, the immanent and transcendent, and everything in between, and faithfully tend to them until something useful for our present apocalyptic moment emerges out of the grotesqueries of life and death. Turning now to the work of Catherine Keller, let us briefly venture to the edge of the Tehomic depths and look at composting as a locus for the incarnational work of growing new Christologies. In Keller's own On the Mystery, she articulates a theology of creation that she describes as, quote, open-ended processes, end quote, that arises in resistance to the presumption of a pre-processed creation, or what she calls creatio ex profundis. For Keller, the process of creation is a continually unfolding drama of becoming and perishing in which we are participants with God. It is not from nothingness, disorder, and chaos that God unilaterally forms creation, but a process of cosmic collaboration in which the interplay of formlessness and form, chaos and order, emergence and collapse find actualization, Keller writes. Undergirding Keller's argument for creatio ex profundis is her attempt to free theology from the endless tensions between those desiring absolute certainty and those beholden to the nihilistic dissolutions with their relativism indifferent to meaning and morality. Keller refers to this binary as the deadly mirror game, and she calls us instead to a third and resolute way of doing theology that resists the above polarizations. Like Anderson's creative exchange, Keller's method should not be understood as a compromise or even some sort of middle ground between the poles of religious absolutism and secular relativism, but a means of undertaking the work of theology with honesty and willingness to be surprised by the possibilities we encounter in ourselves and God amidst the compost heap, or what Keller calls the Tehomic depths. This theological formulation, while not specifically Christological, provides for us another way of understanding the work of composting within the theological framework. A compost Christology is inevitably a theology and process, inviting us to partake in the work of collaborative compost creation to actualize something new out of the old. Toward a compost Christology. Eco-Christology concerns itself primarily with the person and nature of Jesus, the work of Jesus, and what these two things mean within the ecological paradigm. These questions have traditionally been approached from the vantage points of Christology from above, beginning with Christ's divinity, and Christology from below, beginning with Christ's humanity. And depending on the trajectory, they may arrive at either a low or high Christology. One might assume that compost Christology, by definition, begins from below. But I would argue that based on the proposed methodological framework, that it actually subverts this notion of above or below altogether, and instead brings them side by side in the compost heap of Christ's broken body on Golgotha's hill. Furthermore, a compost Christology is relatively uninterested in arriving at a low or high Christology because it is by necessity a Christology that knows that different soils need and call for different amendments, and what might be Christologically useful in one context may not be helpful in another. Compost Christology comes into full bloom when it is given space to breathe and to process, and when we take the time to turn it over and over again, giving rise to a multiplicity of contextual Christologies, considering both our current ecological crisis and our specific context. What Parish, Alabama needs, Christologically and ecologically, though connected to what Minneapolis and St. Paul needs, is different. And so we have to give room for both. Or more than two, I guess. So back on the farm, the rich loam is in our hands still. It's soft and gritty. We have observed that the temperature is still not quite right. This amalgamation of dirt and microorganisms, wood chips and food scraps, will have to be turned over more if it is to fully succumb to the alchemical processes of becoming black gold, able to fertilize all the tomatoes that we needed to transplant already. Much of the same can be said about the work of cultivating a compost Christologies. There is so much more here to be unearthed, like the importance of balancing the green and brown material in our theological compost heap, or the parallels that can be drawn between the three cycles of composting with the incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus. Or how compost embodies a radical kenosis capable of imagining a compost God theology for the empowerment of our communities. While the work of tending to the compost Christology is just beginning, I hope that I have adequately shown how this new Christic paradigm can rise to meet our present ecological crisis by faithfully turning over our Christologies again and again until they become rich fertilizer for the struggle for collective liberation in the world to come. What is needed here in Minneapolis, like I noted, will likely be different than what is needed in my home of Parrish, Alabama. But with patience and faithfulness, I believe this method and metaphor for doing Christological reflection will aid the work of amending and revitalizing the soil from which a new fecundant Christologies can emerge from the compost heap that can provide a hopeful vision for doing eco-theology at the end of the world and turn our hearts to ever-broadening horizons of hope in a world that is on fire. Thank you.